Ruthless bikers harass a woman at a gas station. She removes her wig, and they faint in fear. The roar of motorcycles shattered the quiet afternoon as the notorious biker gang rolled into the sleepy town of Millfield. They were a fearsome sight, leather-clad, tattooed, with eyes that gleamed with cruelty. The Black Skulls, they called themselves, and they had built a reputation striking terror wherever they went. At the heart of Millfield stood Rosie's Gas and Go, a modest station that had served the community for generations. It was here, under the scorching sun, that Sarah Walters found herself that fateful day. A woman in her mid-40s, Sarah was known for her gentle spirit and the way she always had a kind word for everyone. As she filled her rusty sedan's tank, Sarah couldn't help but notice the sudden silence that fell over the station. She looked up to see the bikers pulling in, their engines rumbling like angry beasts. A sense of unease washed over her, but she tried to ignore it, focusing on her task. The leader of the pack, a burly man with a scar slashing across his face, dismounted his bike and sauntered over to Sarah. Well, what do we have here?" he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Sarah kept her eyes down, mumbling a polite greeting. But the biker wasn't satisfied. He circled her like a shark, his gang watching with twisted smiles. "Looks like we found ourselves a little mouse," the leader laughed, reaching out to tug at Sarah's hair. But as his hand touched her locks, something unexpected happened. The hair came away in his grasp, revealing itself to be a wig. Sarah looked up then, her eyes meeting the biker's with a steadiness that surprised him. Beneath the wig, her hair was a short, practical cut, and her face held a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. The biker stepped back, confused. This wasn't the easy prey he had expected. There was something about this woman, a depth he couldn't quite place. From the shadows of the gas station, an old man emerged. He was thin and wiry, with eyes that sparkled with wisdom. The bikers turned to face him, ready for a confrontation. But the old man simply smiled, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I see you've met my daughter," he said, his voice calm and even. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew every face in Millfield, but this old man was a mystery. There was a quiet power about him, a strength that belied his frail frame. Sarah reached up to squeeze her father's hand, a silent message passing between them. The bikers shifted restlessly, suddenly unsure of their position. The old man looked at the leader, his gaze unwavering. "I think it's time for you boys to move on," he said. Not a threat, but a simple statement of fact. For a long moment, no one moved. The very air seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a muttered curse, the lead biker turned away. "Let's go," he growled to his gang, mounting his bike with a vicious twist of the throttle. As the bikers roared out of the station, Sarah let out a shaky breath. The old man patted her shoulder comfortingly, a small smile touching his weathered face. "They'll be back," Sarah whispered, fear edging her voice. "They don't like being challenged." Her father nodded slowly. "I know," he said, "but we'll be ready. Millfield looks after its own." With those words, a flicker of hope ignited in Sarah's heart. She had always seen herself as weak, helpless in the face of aggression. But maybe, just maybe, there was a strength in her that she had yet to discover. As she looked at her father, she knew one thing for certain. The Black Skulls had no idea what they had just awakened. News of the confrontation at Rosie's Gas and Go spread through Millfield like wildfire. In the small, close-knit community, secrets were hard to keep, and the story of Sarah's quiet defiance quickly became the talk of the town. At the Millfield Diner, a cozy spot where locals gathered to swap stories over steaming cups of coffee, the chatter was all about Sarah and her father. "I heard he used to be in the military," whispered Mabel, the diner's owner, as she refilled coffee mugs. "Special forces or something." "No wonder those bikers turned tail," chuckled Joe, a regular at the counter. "I wouldn't want to mess with a man like that." In a corner booth, Sarah sat with her father, trying to ignore the curious glances and hushed conversations. She picked at her blueberry pancakes, her appetite gone. "They're all talking about us," she murmured, keeping her voice low. Her father, whom everyone simply called the Colonel, smiled gently. "Let them talk," he said. "It's good for people to remember that they have the power to stand up for themselves." Sarah sighed, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't feel very powerful," she admitted. "I'm just me." The Colonel reached across the table to pat her hand. "And that's enough," he said firmly. "You showed those bikers that you won't be pushed around. That takes courage." Sarah's mind flashed back to that moment at the gas station. The feeling of the biker's hand on her wig, the sudden surge of anger that had straightened her spine. She had surprised herself in that instant, finding a well of strength she hadn't known existed. As she looked around the diner, Sarah realized that she wasn't alone. In every face, she saw a reflection of her own determination. Millfield was a town of survivors, people who had weathered hard times and come out stronger. There was Martha, who had single-handedly raised 4 kids after her husband passed away, and Bill, who had rebuilt his farm after a devastating fire. These were people who knew what it meant to stand tall in the face of adversity. A sudden commotion outside the diner snapped Sarah out of her thoughts. The unmistakable rumble of motorcycle engines filled the air, growing louder by the second. The Colonel was on his feet in an instant, his hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. Sarah watched as her father strode out of the diner, his shoulders squared and his head held high. Through the window, she could see the black skulls, their bikes lined up along the main street like an invading army. The Colonel walked right up to the lead biker, his stance relaxed but ready. Sarah couldn't hear the words exchanged, but she could see the tension in the biker's posture, the way his hand twitched towards the knife at his belt. But the Colonel never wavered. He stood his ground, meeting the biker's gaze with a steadiness that spoke of inner strength. For a long, breathless moment, the two men stared each other down. Then, incredibly, the biker backed down. With a jerk of his head, he signaled to his gang, and the roar of engines filled the air once more as the black skulls rode out of town. As the Colonel walked back into the diner, a cheer went up from the patrons. They had all witnessed a small victory, a moment when one man's courage had stood against a tide of fear. But Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. The Black Skulls would be back, and they would be looking for revenge. The battle for Millfield's soul had only just begun. In the days that followed, a change came over Millfield. It was subtle at first, a quiet shift in the town's collective spirit. But as the days turned into weeks, it became impossible to ignore. It started with small acts of kindness. Mrs. Jameson, the elderly widow who lived on the edge of town, woke one morning to find her lawn mowed and her garden weeded. When she asked around, no one claimed responsibility, but there was a twinkle in every eye. At the school, a group of students banded together to repaint the faded playground equipment. They worked tirelessly through the weekend, laughing and joking as they transformed the dull metal into a riot of color. Even the town's stray animals weren't forgotten. A makeshift shelter appeared behind the library, stocked with food, water, and warm beds. It became a common sight to see the town's children taking turns caring for the grateful creatures. Sarah watched all of this with a growing sense of wonder. It was as if her small act of defiance had sparked something in Millfield, a determination to stand together against the darkness. At the heart of it all was the Colonel. He had become a fixture in the town, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. People began to seek him out for advice, drawn to his quiet wisdom and unwavering strength. But even as Millfield began to heal, the specter of the Black Skulls loomed on the horizon. They had been too quiet, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before they made their move. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. Sarah was walking home from the Colonel's house, lost in thought, when the roar of engines split the air like a thunderclap. The Black Skulls streamed into town, their bikes kicking up clouds of dust as they circled the main square. At their head rode the scarred leader, his eyes blazing with fury. Sarah felt a thrill of fear as the bikers dismounted, their boots heavy on the pavement. They swaggered towards her, malice etched into every line of their faces. But before they could reach her, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the Colonel, his posture as straight and unyielding as an oak tree. "I thought I made myself clear," he said, his voice ringing out across the square. "You're not welcome here." The lead biker sneered, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. "You think you can stop us, old man?" he growled. The colonel didn't flinch. "I know I can," he said simply. What happened next was almost too fast to follow. The biker lunged, his knife flashing in the sun. But the colonel was faster. With a blur of motion, he disarmed the biker, sending him sprawling to the ground. The other bikers surged forward, but they were met by a wall of townspeople. Men and women, young and old, they stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their determination. At the front of the crowd was Sarah, her eyes blazing with the same fire that had driven her father. She held a baseball bat in her hands, ready to defend her town. The bikers hesitated, taken aback by the show of solidarity. They had come expecting easy prey, but instead they found a community ready to fight. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the lead biker picked himself up off the ground. He looked at the colonel, then at the assembled townspeople. Something like fear flickered in his eyes. "This isn't over," he spat, but his words lacked conviction. As the bikers retreated, a cheer went up from the crowd. They had stood together and they had won. Millfield was theirs and no one could take that away. But even as they celebrated, Sarah knew that the true battle was just beginning. The Black Skulls would be back, and they would be looking for blood. If Millfield was going to survive, they would need more than just courage. They would need to become something greater than they ever had been before. In the wake of the confrontation, Millfield buzzed with a newfound energy. The town had awakened, shaking off the lethargy of fear that had held it in thrall for so long. At the center of it all was the old community center. Once a bustling hub of activity, it had fallen into disrepair over the years, its paint peeling and its windows boarded up. But now, under the colonel's guidance, it was coming back to life. Volunteers from all over town came together to clean and repair the building. They scraped away the old paint, revealing the sturdy bones beneath. They mended the roof, replaced the windows, and planted flowers in the long-neglected gardens. As they worked, something began to happen. People who had lived next door to each other for years, but had never spoken more than a passing hello, found themselves working side by side. They shared stories, laughter, and the satisfaction of a job well done. Sarah threw herself into the work, finding solace in the physical labor. As she painted and hammered, she could feel the weight of her fears beginning to lift. She was part of something bigger now, a community united in purpose. But even as Millfield began to flourish, the threat of the Black Skulls hung over the town like a dark cloud. They had been repelled, but not defeated, and everyone knew they would be back. The colonel, ever the strategist, began to prepare. He organized watch groups, training volunteers to patrol the town's borders. He stockpiled supplies, making sure Millfield could withstand a siege if necessary. But his most important work was with the town's youth. He began to teach them, not just self-defense, but the values of courage, compassion, and unity. Under his tutelage, they began to blossom, their eyes shining with a new sense of purpose. Sarah watched all of this with a mixture of pride and trepidation. She knew that the colonel was preparing them for war, a war that could tear Millfield apart. But she also knew that they had no choice. The Black Skulls had to be stopped, no matter the cost. It was on a quiet autumn evening that the first sign of trouble appeared. Sarah was walking home from the community center, her mind buzzing with plans and possibilities, when she heard the scream. She ran towards the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. As she rounded the corner, she saw a sight that made her blood run cold. A young girl, no more than 12, was cowering against a wall, her eyes wide with terror. Standing over her were 3 of the Black Skulls, their faces twisted with cruel delight. Sarah didn't hesitate. With a cry of rage, she launched herself at the nearest biker, swinging her fists with all her might. The biker staggered back, more surprised than hurt, but his companions were quick to react. They came at Sarah from both sides, their boots heavy on the pavement. She fought with everything she had, but she was outnumbered and outmatched. A blow to the head sent her reeling, her vision blurring. But just as the bikers closed in for the kill, a new sound filled the air. It was the roar of an engine, but not the harsh snarl of a motorcycle. This was something different, something powerful and purposeful. Sarah looked up, her eyes struggling to focus. What she saw made her heart leap with joy and relief. Rolling down the street, its engine rumbling like distant thunder, was an old Jeep, and behind the wheel, his face set in a mask of determination, was the Colonel. The bikers scattered as the Jeep bore down on them, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. The Colonel leaped from the vehicle, his fists already flying. It was over in moments. The bikers lay groaning on the ground, their pride shattered along with their bones. The Colonel stood over them, his chest heaving with exertion. Sarah staggered to her feet, wincing at the pain in her head. The young girl, tears streaming down her face, ran to her, burying her face in Sarah's shoulder. "It's okay," Sarah murmured, stroking the girl's hair. "You're safe now." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew they weren't true. None of them were safe, not as long as the Black Skulls roamed free. As the Colonel helped her into the Jeep, Sarah felt a cold determination settle over her. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had come. The attack on the young girl was a turning point for Millfield. No longer could they pretend that the threat of the Black Skulls was something distant, something that could be ignored. The darkness had come to their doorstep, and they had to meet it head-on. Sarah found herself at the forefront of the town's efforts. She worked tirelessly, coordinating watch groups, stockpiling supplies, and training anyone who was willing to learn. She became a leader, a beacon of strength for a community under siege. But even as Millfield fortified itself, the Black Skulls were plotting their next move. They had been humiliated, beaten back by a town they had considered easy pickings. Their pride demanded retribution, and they were determined to get it. It was the Colonel who first got wind of their plan. He had sources, contacts from his mysterious past, who kept him informed of the gang's movements. When he learned that the Black Skulls were massing for an all-out assault on Millfield, he knew they had to act fast. A town meeting was called, an urgent gathering in the newly renovated community center. Every seat was filled, every face etched with a mixture of fear and determination. Sarah stood at the front of the room, the Colonel by her side. She looked out at the sea of faces, seeing in them the same resolve that burned in her own heart. "We all know why we're here," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the churning of her stomach. "The Black Skulls are coming, and they're coming for us. But we are not helpless. We are not victims. We are Millfield, and we will not be broken." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, a rustling of determination. The Colonel stepped forward, his presence commanding instant attention. "We have a plan," he said, his voice gruff but assured. "But it will take every one of us to make it work. We need volunteers, people willing to stand on the front lines and defend our home." Hands shot up across the room, a sea of resolve. Young and old, strong and frail, they all stood ready to fight for what was theirs. Over the next few days, Millfield transformed. Barricades were erected, choke points established. Every able-bodied person was given a task, a role in the defense of the town. They worked day and night, driven by a common purpose. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, coordinating, planning, encouraging. She barely slept, barely ate, her every waking moment consumed by the need to protect her town. And then, on a cold, gray morning, the Black Skulls came. Sarah watched from a low rooftop as they rolled into town, a black tide of malice and cruelty. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the racing of her heart. Maybe fear, maybe anticipation, maybe both. The battle was joined in an instant. The bikers came in hard and fast, revving their engines and howling like demons. But Millfield was ready. From every window, every rooftop, every barricade, the townspeople fought back with everything they had. Sarah was in the thick of it, swinging a bat and hurling whatever came to hand. Fierce joy burned in her heart, a fierce pride in her town, in her people. They had come together, all of them, and they were holding the line. But the bikers were relentless, driven by a hate that seemed to know no bounds. They came on, a tide of violence that threatened to engulf everything Sarah held dear. And then, just when it seemed that all was lost, just when the defense of Millfield seemed to be crumbling, the colonel appeared. He strode into the heart of the battle, a rifle in his hands and a look of implacable determination on his face. His presence changed everything. Suddenly, the tide of battle shifted. The bikers fell back, confused and disoriented. The townspeople surged forward, their spirits lifted by the sight of the colonel fighting alongside them. And then it was over. As suddenly as it had begun, the battle ended. The Black Skulls fled, their tails between their legs, and Millfield stood victorious. Sarah sagged against a barricade, exhaustion flooding through her. But even as her body trembled with fatigue, her heart soared with triumph. They had done it. They had stood together and they had won. But the cost had been high. As the dust settled, the toll of the battle became clear. Buildings lay in ruins, the streets were littered with debris, and everywhere, the wounded and the fallen. Sarah walked among them, offering comfort where she could, her heart aching with each loss. But even in the midst of the pain, there was hope. Millfield had been tested, and it had not been found wanting. They had proven that they were stronger than anyone had ever believed. And as the town began to rebuild, as they began to heal, Sarah knew that nothing would ever be the same. They had looked into the face of darkness, and they had not flinched. They had stood together, and in doing so, they had become something more. Millfield had been reborn, forged in the fires of adversity. And Sarah knew, with a certainty that blazed in her heart, that they would never be broken again. In the aftermath of the battle, Millfield was a town transformed. The physical scars were evident: buildings reduced to rubble, streets gouged and pitted by the fury of the fight. But it was the changes in the people that were the most profound. There was a new unity among them, a sense of common purpose that transcended all the old divisions. Neighbors who had once been strangers now greeted each other with the warmth of family. People who had once hoarded their resources now shared freely, knowing that their strength lay in their togetherness. Sarah found herself at the heart of this new community. She was their leader now, not just in battle but in the hard work of rebuilding. Day after day, she worked alongside her fellow townspeople, clearing debris, repairing homes, planting new seeds in the scorched earth. It was hard work, backbreaking and often heartbreaking, but it was also deeply rewarding. With each brick laid, each wall raised, Sarah could feel Millfield coming back to life. But even as the town began to heal, Sarah knew that their trials were not over. The Black Skulls had been defeated, but not destroyed. They were still out there, licking their wounds and plotting their revenge. The colonel knew it too. He had seen too much, fought too many battles, to believe that one victory would be enough. He knew that they had to be ready, that they had to be stronger than ever before. And so, even as Millfield rebuilt, it also prepared. The watch groups became a permanent fixture, a vigilant shield against any future threats. The community center became a training ground, where young and old alike learned the skills of survival and self-defense. Sarah was at the forefront of these efforts, her determination and courage an inspiration to all. She pushed herself harder than anyone, driven by a fierce need to protect what she had helped to build. But even as she poured her heart and soul into Millfield, Sarah knew that she was changing too. The battles, both physical and emotional, had taken their toll. She was harder now, tougher, more willing to make the difficult choices. It was a change that did not go unnoticed. The colonel watched her with a mixture of pride and concern, seeing in her the same fire that had driven him for so long. He knew the price of that fire, the toll it could take on a person's soul. And so, one quiet evening, he took Sarah aside. They sat together on the porch of the community center, watching the sun sink behind the hills. "You're doing a good job," the colonel said, his voice gruff but warm. "A damn good job, but you need to be careful. Don't let this consume you. Don't let it define you." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "I don't know how to do anything else," she said at last. "This town, these people, they're everything to me now." The colonel nodded, his face etched with understanding. "I know," he said. "Believe me, I know. But you have to remember who you are, Sarah. You have to hold on to that, no matter what comes." Sarah felt a sudden tightness in her throat, a welling of emotion that she couldn't quite define. She knew the colonel was right, but the path ahead seemed so uncertain, so fraught with danger. But even as the doubts swirled within her, Sarah felt a new resolve taking hold. She would not let this break her. She would not let it define her. She would face whatever came, and she would do it with the strength and the courage that Millfield had given her. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Millfield continued to grow and to thrive, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed so dark. And at the heart of it all was Sarah, a leader, a warrior, a woman forged in the fires of adversity. She knew that the battles were not over, that there would always be new challenges to face. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had Millfield. She had the colonel. She had a community that had proven itself stronger than anyone had ever believed. And with that knowledge, that certainty, Sarah faced the future with a heart full of hope and a soul full of steel. Whatever came, they would face it together. And together, they would never be broken.